Thanks, Eb. All right, welcome everybody to this presentation of Hands-Free, an introduction to switch control on iOS devices. My name is Luis Perez. If you want to catch up with me and see what I'm up to, the best way to do that is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @EyeOnAccess. That's EYEONAXS. So let's continue the conversation and let's stay in touch. Before I get going here, I want to share with you a resource that I put together. It's an ebook that is available on the iBooks store. It's called Hands-Free, from the title of this webinar, Mastering Switch Control on iOS. This is a book that I co-author with Christopher Hills, who himself is an expert switch user. He relies on switch control on both iOS and the Mac to get his work as a video editor done. So it is a really cool book. You get to see Christopher use switch control, and then there's a series of tutorials in there with videos to support them. So this is a great way to continue your learning even after this webinar. The address for that is bit.ly/LFP ebooks. You're going to see other ebooks that I've created for the iBooks store. And just remember that bit.ly short links are case sensitive. All right, the other thing I created for you is a handout. And you will find this at this address, bit.ly, and then /switch control overview. And the first letter of each word is uppercase. So the S in switch, the C in control, and the O in overview, those are uppercase. So again, case sensitive. So that is a handout for you where some of the items I'm going to discuss, you can learn about them at your own pace. All right, so there are two types of switch access that are available on iOS devices. First, you have switch accessible apps. What this means is that the developer of that app has baked in switch control, or switch access, I should say, not to confuse you. And so that means you have switch access while you're inside of that app. But the minute you exit the app, then you lose that switch access because it's been built into the app. And there are many, many apps that have switch access built into them. However, what we're going to focus on today is switch control. And that's a little bit different because that's the comprehensive switch access method. That's a built-in accessibility feature on iOS devices. So that means you can use it inside of apps that support this feature, but you can also use it on the home screen. You can use it in settings. You can use it anywhere in the operating system. So it's a lot more comprehensive than just the switch access that's built into individual apps. Now, if you do want to learn more about switch accessible apps, Jane Farrell, who's based in Australia, she has compiled an excellent list of switch accessible apps. So you can go to her website at janefarrell.com, and you can see just an extensive list of different switch accessible apps and the kinds of switch commands they accept and so on. So again, that's if you want to learn about individual apps that have switch access baked into them or built into them. But today we're going to focus on switch control. So before we get going here, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page, and let's go over a few key terms that you need to know in order for all of this to make sense, or so that you're not confused as I use some of these terms. First, I'm going to refer to switch sources. So a switch source is the way that you interact with the iPad. You send commands to the iPad or other iOS device when you want to activate or perform an action. Fortunately, on iOS, you do have a built-in switch source, and that is the iPad screen. So you can tap the screen, and then that would be the equivalent of pressing a switch. You can also connect a number of external switch interfaces. These switch interfaces will basically, when you tap the switch, it will be recognized on the iPad that you want to perform some type of action. And essentially what these are is basically keyboard shortcuts. Each switch press is essentially a keyboard shortcut that the iPad can recognize and then perform some type of action. And then the final switch source is the camera, which makes for a good demo, but I don't recommend that you rely on this for everyday use. It's still not as reliable as we want it to be. And part of that is that, there's a lot of variables. The lighting, the position of the camera, all of those things can affect the accuracy of this switch source. So here what we're going to focus on is the iPad screen and then external switch interfaces. Now, drilling down a little bit further, as far as external switch interfaces, you have two options. You can go wireless or you can use a wired switch interface. Each of these has their pros and cons. With the wireless, you have fewer wires, of course, which can be quite a convenience. But the Bluetooth connections that these switch interfaces rely on sometimes can be unreliable. You can have a connection drop out, and then that could be a problem for the person that relies on switch control. Wired interfaces tend to be more reliable because, of course, you have a direct connection to the device. There's less lag, which is another issue with wireless. Sometimes it can fall behind a little bit just because of that wireless connection. So with the wired one, you have less lag, a more reliable connection, but then again, you have to deal with wires. And then in terms of switch access methods, there are two that I'm going to focus on today. There are actually three supported on iOS devices, but the two main ones are what I'm going to focus on. There's auto scanning, and that's probably, you're probably familiar with this as single switch scanning as well. So essentially, there's going to be a scanning cursor that's going to move on its own on the screen, and when it gets to the option that you want, you'll go ahead and press your switch. So you only need one switch for this switch access method. And then there's manual scanning, and these are the names that Apple uses in the settings. Auto scanning for single switch and manual scanning for dual switch, which you may also know as step scanning. For this, you will need at least two switches. You'll need one to move the scanning cursor, and then you'll need another one to perform a selection. So in this case, you'll see there's two buttons on the screen. I'm using a switch interface with two buttons. If I press the orange button or the one on the right, then that will move the cursor. If I press the white button, or the one on the left, I will make a selection. And then finally, the last term that I want to throw at you is scanning mode. Most of the time, you're going to use the item mode. And what will happen with item mode is you're going to see a rectangular cursor on the screen, and it's going to move through the screen sequentially, starting from the top and going to the bottom. And then it will initially move by a group. In this case, I'm on the home screen, so it's going to be by line. And then when I go into one of these rows, so it's moving by row, I should say. When I'm going to one of the rows, then it's going to move from left to right or by column. So that's a sequential way of navigating the interface. Point mode is a special mode where you can actually go to any spot on the screen directly by referencing a coordinate. So with point mode, you're going to see a bar move across the screen from left to right. You'll select a point on that plane. Then the bar will move from top to bottom. And again, you can select a point on that plane. And the intersection of those coordinates, that's the point on the screen that you're going to act on. So this is a special mode. You can only access it, can't access it through settings. You can only access it through the scanner menu. And I'm going to demo that for you a little bit later. With point mode, the other thing is this mode is automatically activated if you go into an app that does not support switch control, because Apple wanted to make sure that you still could use that app even though it's not switch accessible. And that's really common with games and a lot of educational apps meant for young children because they use custom interfaces where it's basically just one big image and switch control can't find any spots on the screen to grab onto to show you a scanning cursor in item mode. And so at that point, it will just switch to point mode automatically until you exit out of that app that's not accessible. All right, so before we get going here, some safety announcements, just like on the plane. Again, this is something really important, so I'm going to really emphasize this part of the presentation because I don't want you to send me nasty emails because you've locked yourself out of the iPad. So before you do anything with switch control, I highly recommend that you set up your accessibility shortcut and that you set it up in a way that switch control is the only option listed there. So you will find the accessibility shortcut by going to General, Accessibility, and then all the way at the bottom of the accessibility pane, you're going to find Accessibility Shortcut. And yours should look like this when it's all set up properly. So you'll see here that only switch control has a check mark next to it, meaning that that's the option that I can use for the accessibility shortcut. So with the accessibility shortcut, if I get stuck for whatever reason, something's not working out okay with switch control, I can quickly triple click the home button on my device and that will turn switch control off. And then I'll be using the iPad the way that I'm used to. I can just directly touch on the screen. And if I want to turn on switch control quickly, again, that's a nice handy shortcut. I can triple click the home button and go back in. So this is what it should look like if you have switch control as the only option. When you go into the accessibility pane and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you should see the word switch control next to accessibility shortcut. If it says ask, then that means that you have more than one accessibility feature set up for these accessibility shortcuts. And so what happens when you ask is the option there is that when you triple click the home button, it is going to bring up a menu with a few options. So here you see I have invert colors and switch control set up for my accessibility shortcut. And so the problem with this is if I'm struggling with switch control, if I'm struggling to move the scanning cursor or to make a selection, then that means I won't be able to interact with this menu and I will still be stuck. So that's why we want to make sure this is really, really important. I can't emphasize it enough. Before you proceed, you may want to stop this presentation right now if you're watching and just go into your accessibility shortcut and make sure switch control is the only option there. Now, one last thing with the accessibility shortcut, there are a couple of features that use the accessibility shortcut by default, meaning that this is the way that you activate those features. The two are magnifier and guided access. So with magnifier, the way you launch magnifier is you triple click the home button and then you can exit it just like any app. And with guided access, the same thing. The way that you activate guided access, which is the single app mode on iOS devices, is you triple click the home button. So you may need to temporarily disable both of those, magnifier and guided access, just while you're experimenting with switch control. Once you're more advanced and you know what you're doing, then you can go back in and use switch control in combination with these features. All right, so those are the safety announcements. So again, make sure you have that accessibility shortcut set up properly, because that's going to save you a lot of headaches, trust me. So I want to make sure that you don't get stuck from using your device. Now, once we are ready to get started, the next thing we need to do is to connect our Bluetooth interface. And if you've ever connected a wireless keyboard or wireless headset to your iOS device, then you'll be familiar with this process. It's the same for a switch interface. It's using the same type of connection. So the first thing we want to do is go into the Bluetooth settings. You'll go into settings and then choose Bluetooth. And then you should see your switch interface listed under other devices. And the process will vary for pairing these depending on the interface. So on my interface here, I'm using the Bluetooth from AbleNet. There is a pairing button on the side that I can press. And if all goes well, then I should see it listed under my devices, and it should say connected. At that point, we'll be ready to go. We have our interface connected. So that's the next step, which is to add our switch sources. So here what I've done is I've gone into settings, then general, then accessibility, and then under accessibility, I scroll down until I found the interaction section. So that's where you're going to find switch control. You'll notice right now that it's turned off, but I'll tap on that. And then under switch control, right now it's turned off because we don't have any switch sources added, so it's not going to do much good. Or at least we only have one, but we want to configure a few more. So I will go ahead and tap on switches to add more sources. You'll notice the one switch source that I have is the full screen, and I have it set up to just make a selection. So essentially, I can tap the screen, and then that will make a selection. We do want to add some external switch sources here. I want to add my two buttons on my AbleNet Bluetooth switch interface. So what I'm going to do is tap on Add New Switch. Then it will show me the types of switch sources I can add. We already talked about the screen, but the one that we're going to focus on here is external. And as I said before, the camera we're going to ignore for that for now. Maybe in the future that will be a viable switch access method or switch source. Basically what that does is you can move your head in one direction and it's the equivalent of pressing one switch. You can move your head in the other direction, it's the equivalent of pressing a different switch. So again, that hopefully will become more accurate with time and as this technology evolves, the facial recognition and so on. But right now, we're going to choose external. And then it will ask me to activate my external switch. So I'll go ahead and tap on one of the buttons on my switch interface. I'll give that option a descriptive name. It's up to you what you name them. Here I'm going to use the terminology stepper, just to let me know that this is the one that's going to move the scanning cursor. And then my other one I'm going to name picker. Let me know that it's the one that makes a selection. You can name them orange and white if you're using the Bluetooth. The two buttons have different colors. It's really up to you. Or move and select, whatever makes sense to you. Now, once I've given that switch source a name, the next thing I need to do is choose what action do I want it to perform when I press the button. So for this one, it's going to be move to next item. You'll notice there's some scanner actions there, so those will have to do with navigation. And then there's some system actions. So those will have to do with the system, like pulling up the notification center or switching apps or going to the home screen. For now, I'm just going to choose move to next item under the scanner section. And then a really neat feature that was introduced in iOS 10 is the long press. Actually, I'm trying to remember if it was iOS 10 or 9. These are all kind of getting jumbled up in my mind. But it is a fairly new feature, let's put it that way. And with long press, what you can do is with one switch source, you can have multiple actions. And so that really gives you a little bit more flexibility. Here you see that I have the default action when I tap the switch is going to be move to next item. But I can also set a long press. So if I tap and hold that same switch source, I can perform a different action. So for this one, what I'm going to do is choose from the system section instead of the scanner. And so here I'm going to choose Siri. So anytime that I'm navigating around, if I want to bring up Siri, all I have to do is hold down this switch source or this button, and then that will bring up Siri. So there it is. That's what it should look like when I've set up that switch source. I have select item as the default, and then the long press is set up to the home button on this one. This is what I've done for the full screen. So I can tap and hold the screen, and then that will take me out to the home button. Now, ideally, you could also have, you're not limited to 2 switch sources, 2 external sources. You can also plug in additional ones. I found that the sweet spot is 3 because I use switch access a lot with iBooks. And it's nice to have one for going forward, one for going back, and one for home. So 3 is a really nice number of switches there. But you'll have to experiment with that to find the sweet spot for you. All right, so this is what our setup looks like right now. We have full screen. I've set it up to select an item. And then I have multiple actions for both the picker and the stepper. The stepper is set up to move to next item and activate Siri on the long press. The picker is set up to make a selection and go to the home screen on a long press. All right, so once we've set up our switch sources, the next step is to select our scanning style. And you have a few options here. It will be found if you go back into your settings and into switch control. Right below where we just set up our switch sources, you're going to see scanning style. And you will find options like manual, auto, and single switch step scanning. Right now, we're going to set it up to auto so that the cursor moves on its own, and then we just press the switch to make a selection. So that's single switch scanning, basically. Manual scanning right below that is we need 2 switches. And then the final method, this is fairly recent, is single switch step scanning. And with that, as it says there in the explanation, you'll have to keep pressing the switch. And when it gets to the option that you want, that's when you stop pressing it. And after a delay, it will make a selection for you. I haven't used that one as much. Auto scanning and manual scanning are the 2 most common methods. So those are the 2 that I'm going to focus on. One last suggestion, this is sort of optional, you don't have to do it, but I kind of prefer this way of working, which is to enable auto tap. And you will find that if you go back into your switch control settings you will see tap behavior as one of the options. Right now it's set to the default. So here's how it works with the default. The scanner menu, if I'm in auto scanning mode, will move around. And when it gets to the option that I want, I will tap my switch and a menu will pop up. And it will have all of these options in it of actions that I can perform. Now, if you're just starting out, that could be overwhelming. That could be confusing. So instead, what we're going to do is change this tap behavior. So if I choose that option, I can then set it, instead of the default, I'm going to set it to auto tap. So the behavior now will be that as the scanner moves around, when it gets to the option that I want, if I tap my switch, it will automatically make a selection. So again, that's why it's called auto tap. Now, if I want to see other options, if I want to see the entire menu of options that I could perform, not just the tap, I have to double tap the switch. I have to double press it. And so that's the default behavior, is to bring up that scanner menu. But again, it could be somewhat confusing if you're just starting out. So I highly recommend, if you're just starting out, make sure auto tap is turned on. And then over time, as you get more familiar with switch control, you can go ahead and go back to the default. All right, with that, I want to show you this in action. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and just show you very quickly. We're going to start with auto scanning. And then I will go ahead and switch to manual scanning and then also show you the point mode. So let me share my screen. You should be seeing my iPad. All right, so here we go. Again, I'm going to repeat this one last time. You want to make sure you have your accessibility shortcut set up. And that's what I'm going to use right now to enable switch control. Now, let me go into my settings first, make sure my switch interface is recognized and it's turned on. Okay, I see that it is. My Bluetooth is connected, so that's something you always want to do. Now let's go back to the home screen. I'm going to triple click the home button to enable my switch control. All right, so I think I forgot I had it on manual. So let's do manual first, which is 2 switches. So here's my Bluetooth. I have my orange button. I've set that up to advance the cursor. And I have my white button. That's going to make a selection. So I'm going to press the orange button, and that allows me to move through the options on the screen. And you can see that it's moving through them sequential. What I'm going to do here is just move through kind of slowly through the different options on the screen. With this method of scanning, one of the options in the settings is you can group your different options that are on the screen. So for instance, here you'll see that things are grouped by row. So the first thing I'm going to do is move the cursor using the orange button. I'm just moving by row. I know my app is on the second row, so I'm going to get to the second row. And at that point, I'm going to press my white button, and it's going to allow me to go drill down into that row. Now, I can move my orange button, which will allow me to move the cursor, and I'm going to move by column. So you can see that we're moving through it sequentially. First, we're going to go by row. Then we're going to go by column. And I'm going to go into an app here. So once it's selected, I can press my white button to make a selection. And because I have the default behavior right now, it's going to bring up that menu. I can navigate through the options on that menu and make a choice, right? So again, within the app, I can do the same thing. I can navigate by group with the orange button. I can press the white button or the one that's set up for selection, and then I can navigate by column, or I can navigate through the items that are in that group. And when I get to the one that I want, once again, I will tap my select button, and it will bring up my options. Within those options, you'll notice that it's going to try to guess what I want to do. In this case, is making a tap, and that's a really nice feature they've added. where it tries to be contextual about what you want to perform. But if you select the two dots, so if I move the scanner to the two dots, I can tap those dots and then bring up or tap when those dots are selected, and it can show me more options. So for instance, one of those options here is going home. I'm just going to scan through a few times so you can see. So let's go ahead and just choose to go home. So I'm going to get to that row, make a selection. Now I'm navigating by the items in that row, and then I will make a second selection, and then that will take me to the home screen. So again, you're navigating by group. On the home screen, that's going to be by row. Within the app, it may be by similar controls. So that's really, the grouping is to help you with efficiency. And so when you get to the group that you want, you will make a selection, and then you'll navigate the items within that group. Let me go ahead and just show you point mode, and then I will switch back to my presentation. So with point mode, I will navigate through and just tap a few times until I get the scanner menu. And then within the scanner menu, I'm going to have to find the options here for more. So there's the two dots at the bottom. That means more. And then in here, I'm going to find point mode. So again, the only way you can switch to point mode is by accessing it through the scanner menu. I'll go ahead and select point mode. And you may see a little bit of lag, but at least you'll get an idea of how it works. So there we go. With point mode, let's say I want to open Safari. Instead of having to navigate or sequentially all the way to the bottom of the screen, which could take some time, with point mode now, I can basically just make a selection. So the first time it will move up left to right. The second time it will allow me, it will move from top to bottom. And now I will go ahead and just make a selection at that point. And the action that I want is tap, so I'll go ahead and tap. And we will move into Safari. And again, within Safari, I'm still in point mode. So if I wanted to, let's say, access any of the links on this page, I could just go right to that link without having to navigate through all of the options sequentially. Now, because I have my long press set up on one of these buttons, in this case on the white one, instead of having to navigate through and bring up the scanner menu to choose home, what I'm going to do is just press and hold the white button. And that should take me to the home screen, hopefully. There we go. So I just had a long delay there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to set it back to the default. So give me a second. So in here, I'm going to, again, switch to item mode. And what I need to do is navigate through my scanner options or my scanner menu until I find item mode. And now we're back to that kind of sequential scanning. So in this demo, you've seen the manual scanning mode, which it has you in full control. So basically, you determine the speed at which you move the cursor through. And you determine the pace as well. So there's some advantages to that sense of control. But at the same time, you may have noticed I have to press the two switches quite a bit. And so that can be tiring for some individuals. With auto scanning, that cursor will just move on its own, and I just have to make a selection when it gets to the option that I want. So you don't need to press the switch as much, but you do need to have some timing. You need to get a hold of the timing before you can make effective use of it. So the last thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to turn off switch control. I'm going to go into settings. And again, I'm under the accessibility settings. I'm going to find switch control. And I'm going to enable the tap behavior. I'm going to make it auto tap so you can see how that works. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the scanning style. So we're kind of going backwards here. But actually, this is good because this is probably the way you're going to start. You're probably going to start with manual scanning first, just because of the timing requirements of auto scanning. And then as you get it more advanced, you'll probably switch it over to auto scanning. All right, so I'm going to go to the home screen. I'm going to enable switch control. Once again, if you haven't heard me say this enough, I'm going to triple click the home button. That's my life jacket, if you will, my accessibility shortcut. And this time, the cursor is moving on its own. So I don't have to do anything. I will only press it when it gets to the option that I want. Like so. Again, I go into a row. I'll let it move on its own. When it gets to the option that I want, I'll go ahead and press. And because I've enabled the auto tap behavior in the settings, I can go ahead and just make a selection directly. Let's see, for some reason it's not auto scanning for me. Let me just remove that. Go back into settings. There it is. It should be auto scanning. And it should be set to auto tap. All right, let's try that again real quick. All right, there it is. Now I know that I have the screen as a switch source. So when it gets to the option that I want, I'll go ahead and tap. It'll make a selection. Now we're navigating by column automatically. And what I want to do is open iBooks, so I'll just wait for that to be selected. I'll tap the screen, and it'll automatically launch it because I have that auto tap behavior enabled. So this is the way we want it to behave when we have auto scanning. And so again, with auto tap each time, most of the time, it will just make a selection on its own. If I double tap, I can always bring up the scanner menu and get more options. Let me exit out of here. I'll go ahead and turn off switch control, and then I'm going to stop sharing the screen at this point and go back to my presentation. Okay, so we've looked so far at the two methods, or the two primary methods. There's the third, but these are the two that you're probably going to use. Manual scanning, which is probably how you're going to start, and then auto scanning once you get pretty good with the timing. And then we also looked at how to switch between item mode and point mode. And again, point mode, sometimes you may see it on its own come up, and that's because the app that you've gone into is not designed for switch control. And so Apple tries to make a switch control accessible by enabling that mode automatically. A couple of more advanced features here that I want to talk about. I'm only going to have time to demo one of them, which is recipes. But that's really the key one here. With recipes, you can perform repetitive actions, such as flipping the pages of a book or tapping the same spot on the screen each time that you press the switch. So you don't have to do all the navigation. Let's say I'm in a game, and an educational game, right? And the main action that you want to perform within that game is to press that button in the lower right-hand corner. With recipes, we can set it up so that when we go into a special recipes mode, each time I press a switch, it's just going to press that button. So that could be, there's a little character on the screen and you need to make it jump. So timing within that game is an important consideration. And if we had to navigate around, you know, we would lose that timing. We probably wouldn't do very well in that game. So that's where recipes comes into action and when it proves really helpful. It's also really helpful with iBooks. With iBooks, we want to focus on the reading rather than all of the navigation. So with recipes, we can go into a special mode where when we press the switches, one of them can advance the page, you know, flip the page from right to left, and then one can go back or perform a swipe from left to right. The other feature, which I'm not using as much, but it's brand new in iOS 10, is called device switching. And what this allows you to do is use one switch interface with multiple devices. And so basically, if you have an Apple TV, if you have an iPhone, an iPad, you can start switch control on one device, and as long as they're all on the same network and they can all see each other, then let's say that I want to make a phone call, but only my phone has a connection. I can switch from my iPad, where I first enable switch control, and then go into my iPhone, make that call, and then when I'm finished, I can basically jump back to my iPad and start reading a book or do whatever it is that I want to do on the iPad. So it gives you a lot of flexibility because, again, you're using one switch interface but with multiple devices. And a lot of people like me, we use our devices for different purposes. So my iPad is my primary reading device. My iPhone is my primary communication device in terms of communicating to the outside world. So that's device switching. I'm not going to have time to demo that for you, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It is an option that you will find within the scanner menu. So within the scanner menu, you'll find other devices, and then you can perform that back and forth switch. What I do want to spend a little bit of time on is how to create a recipe. And I'm going to show you this with some screenshots, how to set it up, and then I'm going to demo it for you briefly on the iPad itself. All right, so with recipes, you will find that option if you go into settings, go to accessibility, and then on the switch control, right underneath where you add the switches, the switch sources, you'll find recipes. You'll see that there are two of them already created for you. And these two are really meant for iBooks. So it kind of gives you a head start for using iBooks with switch control. The first one is tap the middle of the screen. That's something that you'll do quite a bit in iBooks because that's how you bring up a lot of the options on the iBooks interface. Most of the time they're going to be hidden so that you can focus on the page. And so there is a recipe for doing that in case you need to go into the controls and so on. And then turning the pages, which is the one that we're going to use in just a second. But creating your own recipe is really simple. You tap on Create New Recipe. Then you need to assign your switches. So you need to tell switch control like what action each switch is going to perform. So I'm going to tap on Assign a Switch. Then I'm going to begin with the stepper here. That's the one that's going to flip the page from right to left, or it's going to move me to the next page. So I'll choose stepper, and then I'll choose that action, right to left swipe. Then I will repeat the process. I'll assign the second switch. This time I'm going to choose the picker, and then I'm going to choose left to right swipe as the action that I want to perform. Now, ideally, if I were using this with iBooks, I would have 3 switches set up, one for right to left, one from left to right, and then I need to have some way of getting out of this special recipes mode. So ideally, I would have a third switch, which when I press that switch, it would exit the recipes mode and send me back to the default scanning mode. So in here, what I'm going to do is kind of cheat a little bit. I'm going to use the long press action. So on one of these switches, I'm going to assign long press the action of exit recipe. That way, when I'm finished reading the book, I can just long press my white button or my one that I'm using for making a selection, or the one that has the long press action on it. And then I can exit out of the recipe and begin scanning the way that I'm used to do it. So that's what it's going to look like in my setup. Your setup may be a little bit different. Okay, everybody, that's one of the things I want to emphasize about switch control, is that it's highly customizable. So I have my stepper perform a right to left swipe. I have my picker with multiple actions. One will be a left to right swipe, but then if I hold it down, that will allow me to exit out of recipes mode. All right, so let's take a quick look at this. Let me just perform a little bit of setup here. I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to share my screen in just a second, but before I do that, I'm going to set my iPad back to manual scanning. Just so that we don't see a lot of lag. All right, so here we go. I'm going to share my screen, and we should be back seeing my screen there. I'm going to use my triple click shortcut. Try that again. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm on the first row here. I see iBooks is one of the apps there. I'm going to make a selection to go in by column. I'm going to move the cursor until I see iBooks is selected. So I'm going to move my press my orange button. There is iBooks selected, and then I'm going to go into iBooks. I have Auto Tab turned on, so it should select it automatically. All right. Now, while I am here, because I have Auto Tab enabled, in order to bring up the scanner menu, I'm going to have to double tap the white switch. Otherwise, it would just make a selection automatically. That's what Auto Tap does. So in here, what I'm going to do is navigate until I see recipes. I'm going to go by row first, then by column, navigate until I see recipes, select recipes, and then what I want to do here is choose turn pages, because that's the one we just configured. And I'm going to choose turn pages. All right, now I will get a warning on the screen that says my switches are configured for recipes. So that means right now I can't navigate. I can't go to different items on the screen. What I can do is when I press one of these switches, it will perform that same action every time. So in this case, it is flipping the pages from right to left with this orange button. With the white button, it will perform the opposite kind of swipe. That's how I set it up. So you can see how much time this saves me. I don't have to navigate around, bring up the scanner menu, because I do have the options to perform flicks and perform other gestures within the scanner menu, but that would take a lot of effort and a lot of time. So with this, it's as easy as just pressing the switches to go forward and backwards. Now, when I'm finished, again, I need to have a way to get out of recipes mode. And you can set up a separate switch, or you can do what I've done here, which is set up a long press. So I've set up a long press on my white switch or my picker. I will go ahead and tap and hold that down. And then it will say your switches are not configured for their default actions. So now I can navigate around on the screen, and I can make selections and so on. And basically, my old long hold or long press of going to the home screen, that still works. I can tap and hold it, and after a delay, it should take me to the home screen. All right, so I will go ahead and go back into our presentation here and just cover a couple of last things. All right, so the last point that I want to make is switch control is highly customizable. If you go into the switch control options, you will see all kinds of different settings that you can configure for ensuring that this feature really meets the needs of your individuals that you're working with. Depending on the switch access method that you have it selected, you will have different timing options. So for instance here, if I have auto scanning selected, I can choose how fast that cursor moves around on the screen. I can have it pause on the first item, and that's really helpful because it's if I'm scanning by row and then by column, it's possible that I will miss that first item when I go into the column. So with this option, it will add a delay on that first item, on that first column, so that you don't miss it. You can choose the number of times I will go through. It's from 1 to 10. I have it set to 5 here. And when it gets to 5, it basically will hide the scanner or the scanning cursor. But I can bring it back just by pressing my switch. And then it will scan again another 5 times. Lots of options. You can add a whole duration on the switch stabilization. So if you have somebody who has unwanted switch presses, you can make it so that they have to hold it for a certain amount of time before the switch press is recognized. So again, these are all things you can configure to make sure that switch control is set up for the individual needs of the people you work with. For the audio, you can enable a click sound effect. And then really powerful, you can enable speech. So when you enable speech within the switch control options, it's essentially like you have VoiceOver turned on at the same time. And so I've worked with individuals who are blind but also have motor difficulties. And so this is really helpful because they're not using two accessibility features. In a way they are, but it's just one feature with an additional option turned on. And when you go into speech, you can choose your voice, you can choose the speaking rate. So it's essentially like VoiceOver is built into switch control already. You can choose whether you want to group the items. That's the default behavior. That makes for faster navigation, as you saw during my demo. It groups things into rows or into groups, and then you can drill down to access the individual items within each group, or you can turn that off if you want. And then for visuals, you can enable a large cursor, which I did, and you can also change the cursor color, which I made orange so that you could see it better. And then at the bottom, you'll see Save Gestures. So any gesture that you can create or you can draw on the screen, you can save those, and then you can access them from within recipes. And this is really helpful for some games that your kids might like for instance, Angry Birds. You know, in Angry Birds, you perform that gesture of kind of swiping from one side to the next in order to bring the little character back on the slingshot. Well, we can draw that gesture on the screen, save it as a saved gesture, and then we can access it from within recipes so that each time I press the switch, it will perform that same action. So again, take a look at these options for configuration. And then the last thing that I want to leave you with is, again, I want to encourage you to download and access this free book. It's hands-free, and it's also a free book on Mastering Switch Control on iOS by Christopher Hills and yours truly. And the address again is bit.ly/LFP ebooks. And you'll see that ebook listed as one of the options there. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your time, for watching this presentation. Again, you can connect with me on Twitter. I'm at EyeOnAccess, EYEONAXS. I also have a website. It's at luisperezonline.com. And lastly, I want to thank AbleNet for giving me the opportunity to come to you through this webinar and their information and the various ways in which you can connect with them through various social media. So with that, that's it for me. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. I hope you've learned about switch control, the basics, and then happy scanning.
Please stand by.